reimbursements. My name is Carlos Collins. I'm the CSUSA Grants Manager. We have
James Hargreaves. I'm the Grant Specialist for Florida.
Kristina Hernandez, Grant Specialist for North Carolina, Michigan, Georgia, and Louisiana.
And we also have Douglas Riviera, the SOA trainer. He participated in the development of this presentation. He's unavailable to participate today. And Jamie Jones, the accounting supervisor, also provided some content for today's presentation. Unfortunately, she won't be on the call either. Before we get started with the presentation, one quick housekeeping note. We'd like to ask everyone that's participating on the call today to please place your phones on mute. This is going to prevent background noise during the presentation. So if you could at this time again, please place your phone on mute. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can use the chat function that's enabled within GoToMeeting, and we will be sure to make sure we address questions before the end of the call. All right, the agenda for today's meeting, we're going to start out with the essential question. We're going to discuss the purpose of this training, outline several learning objectives. We're going to do a demonstration of the expenditure tracking process, discuss some important dates. There will be a quick quiz at the end, so we're going to ask everyone to pay close attention to the content for the presentation. And then we're going to open the floor for questions and answers at the end of the meeting. So, the essential question: why is it important to track grant expenditures and reimbursements? By the end of this presentation, this is the question we're hoping everyone will be able to answer. The purpose of this presentation is the purpose of the Expenditure Tracking Log is to improve financial accuracy and reporting and ensure that all grant funds are expended during the school year. When we look at improving financial accuracy and reporting, there are three things we want to consider. We want to consider standard reporting documentation, the separation of the school's operating budget from the grant budget, and the correct coding of purchase orders to the correct general ledger subaccount. So when we look at these three items, we're definitely looking at accounting functions. In each district, we know that there's different templates and different documentation that they require for reporting purposes. When this information is transferred back to the support center, it's important that it be in a standard format so that accountants for different schools have the same information in the same format and are able to correctly document your school's expenditures. The accounting department now has an opportunity to separate the grant budget from the operating budget. The ETL allows them to correctly code grant-funded purchases to the grant budget. In the event that this does not happen, a school's budget runs the risk of being over or understated because grant charges are being applied to the school's operating budget. And again, with the ETL, we are able to the accountants are able to correctly code purchases and expenditures to the correct general ledger subaccount for your grants. The second purpose, ensuring the expenditure of all grant funds during the school year. We evaluate three things from an accounting perspective in this area: reporting transactions in the correct fiscal year, monitoring cash flow, and ensuring the timely expenditure of grant funds. One of the things the ETL does is it serves as a source of documentation, a reference and documentation of when grant expenditures actually occur. This ensures that funds for grants that carry over the standard fiscal year for CSUSA, which ends June 30th, it ensures that any charges that occur after that period for grants that run longer, say grants that expire on September 30th, which I know some of your schools have, are coded in the correct fiscal year. So in some instances, the school year and the fiscal year for a grant are going to be different. And again, to ensure that funds are applied to the correct fiscal year, we need to know the date that those transactions occur. The second thing that we want to look at is cash flow. By being able to correctly classify grant-funded expenditures, it gives a clear picture of how much cash the school has available at any given point in time. By being able for the accountant to be able to verify transactions, check cash availability, and ensure that reimbursable funds are coming back in, it allows the accountant to work with you and your principal to know how much funding you have available for purchases at any given point. And again, when we make a distinction between the operating budget and the grant budget, any funds that are being charged to the grant budget and we know are reimbursable gives the school opportunity to use more funds in the operating budget to make purchases and continue with day-to-day functions. The last thing we want to look at is ensuring the timely expenditure of grant funds. The ETL also helps us understand and keep track of when reimbursements are submitted and how much grant funding the school has available over the course of the school year. In an ideal situation, all grant funds will be expended before March, with the exception of those funds allocated towards salaries. So this is something that everyone wants to keep track of over the course of the school year. All right, so for this presentation, we want to outline two learning objectives. For those who just joined the call, please place your phone on mute. Thank you. We want to outline two learning objectives for this presentation. At the end of this presentation, we want everyone to understand why it's important to track grant-related expenditures on the Expenditure Tracking Log, which we also refer to as the ETL. And we want everyone to know the important dates and deadlines for submitting an ETL, reimbursements, and supporting documentation. Tracking grant expenditures is a 5-step process. We have this document process available, which we will be distributing during the call, and after the call, we will follow up with a copy of the presentation, as well as the process documents that explain these 5 steps for you to reference as you go through this process moving forward. I also want to note that the grant specialist assigned to your school, either Kristina or James Hargreaves, will be available to assist you with this process as well. So, the first step in tracking grant expenditures is opening the Expenditure Tracking Log spreadsheet. The Expenditure Tracking Log is an Excel document that is going to be distributed by your grant specialist.
Okay, so when you guys are looking at this form and you open it up, we want you to pay special attention to the 2 green boxes we have highlighted. The top green box is capturing the name of the school, the grant name, and the grant period. This is really important. When your grant specialist sends over the ETL to you, please make sure that your school's name is on there, that you're looking at the correct grant and the grant period as well. On the bottom of the page, you're going to notice a green box around the tab of the worksheet. The tab also has the name of the grant. Some schools only have 1 grant, so you'll only see 1 grant name. But if your school has multiple grants, you're going to have multiple tabs. Please make sure that you enter your tracking documentation information in the correct grant tab.
Okay, now we're going to move on to explaining the various parts of the ETL document.
So in this particular page, this is the left-hand side of your ETL. I have emailed you all documents. I have emailed you all the documents that go with this training, so you'll be able to look at it later. But this section in particular captures the budget detail. This is the approved budget information that's submitted to your state, local district, or foundation that breaks down all the budget information for the grant amount. Each yellow line the grant specialist fills in with the budget detail amount, and on the very bottom of that section you're going to notice the total grant amount. So in this particular case, the full amount is $75,563.19. We ask that you please don't change this. Only the grant specialist should be entering details in the yellow. moving to the right of the ETL, in this green box, you're going to notice the white and gray areas. You're going to notice that this is where you'll be entering information. So on the left-hand side, the grant specialist enters in the yellow. You will be maintaining the information on the white lines along with the respective grant budget details. So we'll get into more details about that in a few minutes. So if you notice on the top, in the green box, we've highlighted all the descriptions for the ETL. You'll be entering either salaried or non-salaried information, and you have to pay special attention to where you're putting that in. You want to make sure that you always put in a description under the expenditure description column. You always want to make sure that you enter PO or PO date or invoice information on the salaried section of the ETL. And when it comes to an employee, you want to make sure that you enter the employee's name and job description on the section that responds to them. In the blue, the reason we put that in a different color is that's the information that's probably most important to the CSUSA Support Center. In this particular section, you're either going to enter in the reimbursement request column the amount that you've submitted for reimbursement, or in red, you're going to be outlining what you plan to submit for reimbursement. There's also a column to the right of the future expenditures column known as the district managed column. Accounting really wanted to put that in there, and that's because there's, in some cases, some schools in Florida particularly don't necessarily submit for reimbursement, but they may get they may be getting a cash advance, or they may be ordering directly through the district. So you want to put there the information still because it's an asset in the building, but it's not necessarily money that the accountant is going to be seeing. So definitely make sure that your numbers are correct, and that if once you have full documentation, you move it from the future expenditure column or into the reimbursement request column in black, or use the blue column when it comes to district managed funds.
Okay, now we're going to look at step 2. Having that basic understanding of the ETL, and understand that we're going to provide a live demonstration of this, of the document, of how to update the document during this presentation to give you a first-hand look at what the different sections are. So as we move to step 2, the first thing we want to do is find the line item to be updated. As Kristina mentioned, these are going to be the yellow lines in the spreadsheet.
White line.
I'm sorry, the white lines in the spreadsheet. The question that you want to ask is the expense related to compensation and staffing, or is it related to a purchase? When it comes down to the purchases and to non-personnel grant expenditures and grant personnel expenditures, there are two separate processes. Again, we will be providing a demonstration of how to update those two items, line items, at this time.
Do you want to put up the ATL, or do you want me to? You have it.
It's showing up on the screen. No. Slideshow should have turned off. I believe that's a share screen. Bear with us while we pull up a presentation. While we pull up a copy of the spreadsheet.
Okay, everyone. So this is an example of an ETL. A lot of you should have it. I know in my state they've been using it. I know James has been emailing it to the Florida schools. If you haven't received it, later on, please email him for it. But I want you to notice a few things. Again, we go back to the left side of the ETL that has the function code, object code, deliverable type, and then the budget details. Again, please do not touch this, but this is really important to what you'll be doing. Please, when you first open up your spreadsheet, aside from making sure that your school name and that you're on the right tab for the right grants, you want to start reading the budget detail because this is going to tell you what you have available to spend and on what you can spend it on. So for example, in this particular budget, there's an intervention specialist at a certain amount that you can spend. This person you would have to identify as your Title I intervention specialist. That would come from the principal. And then once you have your payroll preview every couple of weeks, you'll start entering that information. Because this grant starts on 7/1, we can start claiming her salary from 7/1, the first pay period ending 7/15. On the last date of activity, you would enter the pay period ending date, 7/1 through 7/15. In the expenditure description line, you'd enter her name and her title. On your pay preview or your check vouchers, whatever you're using as your documentation, you have to include the department number. This was a new addition this year that accounting wanted to include on this form. So please make sure you do this. This helps them identify the employee and reclassify it to the grant. You also want to go ahead and put in the employee start date. If this employee has an end date, then towards the end of that, you would go ahead and include that eventually. But if you notice, you would only be filling in employee start date and employee end date. You'd skip past the non-salaried expenditure section, which ends on column O. And if you do have a full backup documentation, which in this case would be your pay preview or check voucher, whatever you're using from ADP as your proof, you'd put in yes if you have it or no if you don't have it. If this is the first request you are making on your grant for that year, you'd put in request 1. And you'd go ahead and put in the amount of that person's salary. So in this case, it's 1708.25. You'd change it from a future expenditure to a current reimbursement request amount. That tells your accountant that you have submitted this to your state or district for reimbursement. If you notice, we had already pre-populated this section with the amount. The reason we are doing that is because this also helps finance. So when you do have an employee that you know is going to be grant funded, the best thing to do is to go ahead and forecast that salary for the whole grant period, and that's going to let us know how much of that grant will be used in the future and how much of that has been submitted for reimbursement already. So you'll be switching from one column to the next. That's how you would enter a salary position. That would work the same way for a tutor. It would work the same way for a stipend. Make sure that you enter the pay period ending date, not the pay date. In terms of a purchase, you still have to put in a date. So in this case, you'd put in the last date of activity. So let's say that the last date of activity is just a requisition date. Then you'd go ahead and enter the requisition date. If it's a PO date, you put in the PO date. As you go collecting documentation, this date column should be getting updated with the non-salaried purchase. So if you notice, we look at the left on here, and you notice it says software licenses. Well, hero tracking would be considered part of that category, so we include it here. We'd go ahead and skip past the employee start date and employee end date. You'd have to put in a vendor name, so I don't know the name of the vendor, but let's say that this vendor is Hero or another company. You'd put that in so that accounts payable can locate it, as well as accounting. You'd put in the requisition number. You'd go in and put in the PO date if you had one. You'd go in and put in the PO number once it's generated. And again, it's really important that the SOAs do this because the SOAs receive those POs to their emails, and you have the most accurate date from when it was sent to the vendor. Once you have an invoice, you put the invoice number, and then eventually, once the accounts payable cuts the check, you should be putting in the check number. If you have all that information, you would go ahead and say yes, that you do have all your documentation. And again, what was once a future expenditure now becomes a reimbursement, meaning that you've submitted it. And at the same time, if this wasn't on request 1, let's assume that this was done a month after the first one was done, well then maybe in this case it would have been request 2. It's really, really important that you don't forget to put in those request numbers, because when you submit a great deal of documentation for reimbursement, it confuses the accountant, so it helps them know in what bulk submittal you did it in. Other than that, that's pretty much all you have to do to fill it in. If it wasn't something that you submitted for reimbursement, but assuming that you got a cash advance, like in the situation of some of our schools in Florida and Michigan, then instead of putting it in as a reimbursement that you submitted, well, then you'll just say that it was applied to the cash advance your school already received or something the district already bought. I think that should cover pretty much everything for salaried and non-salaried. James, do you have anything to add? Or?
I do not.
No. Okay. That's pretty much it. And you'll notice that towards the bottom, as you go entering those numbers, whether it's a reimbursement amount or a future expenditure amount, it goes on the bottom doing subtotals. So you'll know how much remains on your grant, and you know how much would have been submitted for reimbursement, how much is outstanding to be submitted, how much the district has covered, so on and so forth. And again, this is what accounting and finance really look at. So I think that's pretty much it.
All right, thank you, Kristina. I'd like to reiterate throughout this call that your grant specialist will definitely be available to assist you if you have any questions along the way about how to update your ETL document. All right, give us just a moment as we transition.
Next, we're going to talk about tracking grant expenditures. This is going to be step number 3, gathering the ETL and reimbursement support documentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the documentation required to submit for reimbursement on each type of grant purchase. First, we're going to start with non-salaried purchases. In most districts and in most states, the 3 required documents are going to be the original purchase order, the invoice, and the check image. When we move over to personnel, it will be the pay preview and the time and effort log. Some of you may not be familiar with the time and effort log, but this is the documentation that's going to be used in tutoring and stipends to ensure that the teachers that are being paid through the grant are working the hours that is being requested on the reimbursement, as well as any students that are tutored within that time. Travel seems to be the most arduous documentation to gather with the way we use Trevisan for travel expenses. For travel expenses, we're going to use a travel expense report. This is going to include all of your meals, gas, tolls, parking receipts. You'll also need a copy of the agenda to show what the conference covered, hotel receipts, car rental receipts, airfare vouchers or confirmations, your Trevisan email confirmation, and you're going to have to contact the support center to get a copy of your bill back invoice, because as you all know, when you use Trevisan, it bills CSUSA and we invoice the school on a separate occasion. You'll need that document in order to complete a compliant reimbursement, as well as the check image.
Okay. And in reference to the purchases, James, can you tell us where we will locate these 3 pieces of documentation?
For purchases non-salaried, the purchase order is normally sent directly to you from the vendor. The invoice you'll be able to attain also from the vendor, and the check image is going to come from the accounts payable office. If you have difficulty gathering any of these 3 pieces of information, Kristina or I will be able to help assist you find that documentation so you may add it to your reimbursement. For personnel, you're going to contact the payroll department. They typically have the previous pay period's information ready to hand to you a week after the pay period ends. Again, if you have difficulties receiving this information, Kristina and I can assist you. As for travel, all of your receipts are going to be kept by the person traveling, so they'll gather the receipts for meals, gas, tolls, and parking. Your Trevisan email will be emailed to you for the person who booked it, correct? And the bill back invoice is going to be received from Elizabeth Capito in the Service Center accounting office.
Taking the time and effort log.
What's up?
And the time and effort log.
The time and effort log, I apologize. The time and effort log should be kept on site and should be filled out daily as tutoring occurs.
Okay, now we're going to move on to step 4 in the process. Step 4 is to email a copy of the documentation and updated ETL to the grant specialist assigned to your school. This process will need to be completed at the end of each month. Step 5 is to file the support documentation for cash advances or submit a request for reimbursement. Here we're simply stating the support documentation that we just reviewed. Those items need to be kept on file at the school, and copies also need to be submitted to the support center. This is the same documentation that you would submit to the district to support a reimbursement request, or to document any transactions that occurred against a cash advance. So now we're going to move on to the important dates that you want to remember. The 20th of each month. By the 20th of each month, reimbursements will need to be submitted to the district. ETLs will need to be updated, as well as the backup documentation will need to be collected that supports both the reimbursement and the ETL. We're asking that when the reimbursement is submitted to the district, that a copy is also gathered for, also sent to your grant specialist here in the support center. Information will always be gathered for the previous month. So, for September 20th, the information for August will be submitted in the reimbursement request. The ETL will be updated with information from August, and the backup documentation will also be from August. At the end of each month, grant specialists will be sending out exception reports for any schools that have not submitted updated reimbursements or have submitted reimbursements or updated ETLs. Now we're going to move on to the last portion of the presentation, which is the quiz. Everyone can relax. This is going to be an open answer quiz, and I don't think the questions are going to be too difficult. At this time, when we present the questions, you can either respond through the chat feature or unmute your phone to state your answer. Okay, so we're going to move on to the first question. What are 2 reasons why it is important to track grant-related expenditures and reimbursements?
So that you can see how much money your school still has.
Exactly. That's one reason. Does anyone else have the second reason?
Julia put financial accuracy on the chat.
Exactly. So those are the 2 items we want to look at. The purpose, again, for the ETL is to improve financial accuracy in reporting and ensure all grant funds are expended during the school year. Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to move on to the second question. What does ETL stand for?
Expenditure Tracking Log.
All right. Thank you for your thank you for that answer. Expenditure Tracking Log is correct. Who creates the ETL for your school?
I do.
Okay, so I did hear the correct answer come up. Just a moment. The correct answer is the grant specialist assigned to your school. So the grant specialist will actually create the template, the document for you, and we're asking that the SOAs update the document from month to month. So the initial template showing the line items in yellow will be set up by the grant specialist, and then as the expenditures occur, you'll be updating that document. If you haven't already received a ETL for your school, you're going to need to reach out to your grant specialist to get a copy. And again, they'll be available to assist you with updates and any questions you might have about the document and how to keep it updated. The next question is, who updates the expenditure section of the ETL? These will be columns F through T in the spreadsheet.
The school operations.
That's what?
The school operations administrator.
Right, our administrator.
All right, you got it. All right, school operations administrator. And we're going to move on to the last question now. When should you submit your updated ETL and backup documentation to your grant specialist, to your school's grant specialist?
The 20th. By the 20th of each
20th
month.
of every month.
By the 20th of each month. The first ETL will be due on September 20th, 2015. Again, the grant specialist will be available to assist your school. The last thing we want to do now is go open the floor for questions and answers. Does anyone have any questions about the process or any information that we've covered today?
Oh.
All right, well, we're going to go ahead and prepare to wrap up this morning's call. Do we have anyone that joined the call during the presentation that we can document for attendance?
Amanda Zachary.
Okay, Amanda, we'll definitely add you to the attendance list.
Thank you.
One last thing. Following this call, we will send a copy of the PowerPoint presentation out to everyone who's attended today, along with the process and the process and procedure documents for the information that we covered today. So it's going to look at first the 5 steps for updating the expenditure tracking log, and it's going to provide 2 support documents that explain what you need to do to track personnel and non-personnel related purchases. There will also be a sample ETL document included, along with a link to a YouTube presentation for today's call, which you will be able to reference in the future if you need to. With that being said, if there are not any additional questions, we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's call. I want to thank everybody for participating and taking the time to dial in. We appreciate your support and keeping track of the grant expenditures at your school, and look forward to a successful school year. Thank you.